I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to Marked by Grace, a podcast applying the grace of Jesus to all of life. All right, it is the week of May the 13th. This is Marked by Grace, and this week I'm answering your question about the difference between adopted and biological children. The only questions I answer on the podcast are the ones you send in. So if you have a question you'd like me to address, you can send it in to markedbygrace@fbcjax.com. That's markedbygrace@fbcjax.com. I'd love to hear from you. The question this week is, are biological children the same as adopted children? And in the context of the question, you're talking about a disagreement. So there's people you love and are in relationship with, and they're saying that, hey, adopted children aren't the same as biological children. And you're asking me to weigh in on that. So I'm going to weigh in on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the way I'm going to weigh in. And the way I'm going to do that is by evaluating it with two different categories. So are biological children the same as adopted children? Well, we can evaluate that in terms of physiology, and we can evaluate that in terms of affection. Okay, those are the two vectors that I'm going to use. Physiologically, biologically, genetically, are biological children the same as adopted children? Well, of course not. That's the point. Biological children have your same biology. They're composed of the parent's DNA, and adopted children are the biological children of other people and don't share the DNA of their parents. Now, this is not insignificant. Okay, this is actually very significant. And in fact, to prove it, I'll tell you a story. My family is complicated. My family of origins, a lot of complicated stories. And if you've heard me talk for any period of time, you have some idea of that complexity. But one thing that is complicated about my life growing up is that the man I grew up with and the man I call my dad is not my biological dad. Now, that relationship is something actually a lot more complicated than adoption. That's another story for another time. But the man I call my dad, the man I grew up with, the man whose name is on my birth certificate, actually, is not my biological father. And I have known that for a long time. I think I found that out when I was about 5. I think I was in kindergarten, and I found that out in a very, very hard and a painful way. Also, another story for another day. But I have known for decades that the man I call my dad is not my biological father. The reason that's significant, and I'm telling you that story, is because even though I've known it for decades, I realized a few years ago at the hospital, I was checking in for surgery, and I was filling out all the hospital forms that you have to fill out before they admit you into the hospital. And it was asking me questions about my dad. They wanted biological markers. It was asking me family history, and if my dad had cancer or heart disease, asking me the same things about my mom. But they were asking me the questions about my dad, and I was answering the questions about my dad that I call my dad, but the man who's not my biological father. And I looked at this and I was like, wait a second, none of these answers are true. And for my whole life, I just realized, you think I'm an idiot, and maybe I am, but for my whole life, every medical form I've ever filled out at any doctor's office, in any hospital, I've always answered those questions with respect to the man that this is my dad, the man that I call my dad, but not my biological father. And so all of that information is incorrect. What they need is biological markers. They need to know what things I am at risk for because of the DNA that I have. And so these things are important. If there is a physiological difference between biological children of one set of people and their adopted parents. Those things are significant. We want to know how to treat medical problems. We want to know about risk markers for various diseases. You might be a different color, different ethnicity than your adopted parents. And so that physiological difference is a difference, and it's not insignificant. But it's also not the most important vector of evaluation. The other evaluation, as I mentioned, is not just physiological, but is affection. That physiological difference is real. It's not insignificant, but it is the least important of the two. The real issue, and I suspect the question isn't clear, but I suspect what is going on is what's really at issue in this debate is if those kids aren't yours, you can't love them as much. Could be wrong about that, but this issue of affection is the most important issue. And here's the thing. We would say that parents who have kids in their home that are a mix, some are adopted, some are biological, we'd say there's going to be important physiological differences that we need to think about for medical care. But the most important reality, the thing that's on the table every day, all day long, when we're driving to church and going to the park and sitting at dinner, the thing that's the most important is that we have the same kind of affection for all of our children, whether they are biological or whether they are our adopted children. This is not a sentimental answer, but it is a theological answer. It comes in a passage of Scripture like we read in John chapter 17, starting in verse 20. Jesus says, I do not ask for these only, he's talking about his disciples, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you've given me, I've given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Jesus says to God the Father that it's important that the world know that you love your people, Christians, that you love them even as you have loved me, your only begotten Son. Listen, I remember the first time I read that and it hit me over the head, and I was overwhelmed with the fact that when I repented of my sins and trusted in Jesus Christ, God the Father loves me like he loves his only begotten Son. This is a glorious promise. And here's the thing. If God can love sinful rebels adopted into his family through faith in Jesus Christ just as much as he loves his only begotten Son, then we can love our adopted children as much as we can love our biological children. And not only can we, but we should. And in fact, I'll tell you one more story. There is a picture. My dad, again, it's complicated, but my dad knew as soon as he found out that my mom was pregnant that we were not his kids. He knew it was not possible. And so he knew all through the pregnancy. He knew immediately after the birth that this kid that was coming was not going to be his. And 5 minutes after I was born, as my parents tell the story, the doctor said, Mrs. Lambert, we hate to tell you this because we know you've had a hard day, but there's another one in there. And my mom did not know what they were talking about. And she said, another what? And they said, another baby. I was born in the 1970s. Ultrasound technology was not as pervasive as it was then. So she was pregnant with twins and she thought she had a single. And so my dad knew this kid for 8 months was not his. And then all of a sudden, on September the 13th, 1979, he found out that these two kids were not his. But one of the first pictures that was ever taken of me is a picture of me in an infant football jersey, nestled in one of my dad's arms with my twin brother nestled in the other arm and him smiling right between us. And I tell you what, my dad died about 10 years ago. But for his whole life, from the moment I was born, I have never thought anything than that he loved me just as much as if I came from his own body. And that love changed my life. One of the people who's loved me more than anybody else in my entire life was my dad. And so I say that to you to encourage you. If you've got adopted kids, or if you're thinking about adopting kids into your family, there's going to be physiological differences, and that's important, but it's not what's most important. What's most important is that you pour your heart and your soul into a life of love for those children, and that love will change their life.